As many of you know, the World Bank has been out front on the importance of empowering girls, and many of us have quoted the bank's declaration that, quote, investing in girls and women is smart economics. Here to tell us more about the World Bank's 2012 World Development Report on Gender and Development is one of the co-authors of the report, Dr. Sudhir Shetty. Dr. Shetty is a leading economist who has served the bank in Africa and in the Pacific, and now devotes his time to the issue of gender and development. Before joining the bank, Dr. Shetty was a professor at Duke University. Dr. Shetty, please join me up here at the podium.
Thank you very much, Farah, and thank you to you and the organizers for this opportunity to present the findings of the World Development Report. Like you, I'm speechless at what we heard, so perhaps the report was redundant. But we've done it. So, and here it is. This is the overview. I think all of you have a copy of it. It's an overview of a rather long report. As someone once said, we didn't have the time to write a shorter report. The full report is about 350 pages. And what the World Bank does is every year we put out the World Development Report on a different topic. And in 2012, our executive board, which is composed of all of the 187 member countries, decided it was time to do a report on gender equality and development. And this is the culmination of a year's work. I'm one of the two directors. I should tell you at the outset, we're a completely gender-balanced team, but Farah thought it would be much more powerful to have the male co-director. I have a female colleague who's a co-director, to have the male co-director tell you why gender equality makes sense in the context of development. So let me, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, just run you very quickly through the main points of this report, and I hope that at the end I will provoke at least some of you to take a look at the report in more detail. It's on our website, and there's lots of background work. So what does the report do? Well, what the report does is it tries to look at the relationship between gender equality and development. We are, after all, a development institution. So the question we are posing is, why is gender equality important in the context of development? And the bottom line, our main message is for two reasons. One, gender equality is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because, as many of you articulated, it is wrong for societies to leave out 50% of their population. This is not some minority group that can be ignored. This is half the population of every country in the world, and therefore it is the right thing to do. As Amartya Sen and other economists have reminded us, development without gender equality is meaningless. Gender equality is an essential and integral part of development. So that's the rights part. But it would have been, I think, not very compelling for the World Bank to have come and written a report on the rights-based argument for gender equality, because we are, as I said before, an economic institution. So we then ask the second question, which is, what does it matter for development as we know it? And that's where we come to our second message, which is, as Madame Bachelet put it, it is the smart thing to do. And in what way is it the smart thing to do? And what we do in the report is summarize and articulate what we think is the best evidence for the relationship between smart policy and gender equality. And we basically articulate three arguments. One, if countries do not include 50% of their population, they're going to be less productive. Their economies are going to be less productive. It's a very simple argument. It makes a lot of sense. There is no reason to believe that talent is distributed particularly in favor of men and boys and against women and girls. And therefore, it stands to reason that if you include women and girls, you are going to have a more productive economy. We summarize the evidence for this. So we show, for instance, how the Food and Agriculture Organization shows that if you include women in farming, the world could get at least between 2.5% to 4% greater agricultural output. We show how that is can be seen in systematic and carefully done studies in countries as diverse as Burkina Faso and Malawi in Africa. Second, we show how within the economy, the barriers that prevent women from working in particular parts of the economy, if you remove those, how it can lead in some countries to increases in productivity of the order of 15 to 25%. So that's a productivity argument. Second, we show how outcomes, development outcomes for the next generation are likely to be hurt if women are not equal. The argument, again, is simple. We have evidence from country after country, rich countries such as the United Kingdom, poor countries such as Bangladesh, which show that where women are more educated, where women are healthier, where women have more control over resources, their children are better fed, better educated, and healthier. There's a clear positive outcome in terms of the next generation. And third, we show in the report how if you have gender equality, you will have more representative societal institutions, more representative societal policies, and that too is better for long-term development. There are very careful studies done in India, for instance, which is one of the countries where there are reservations for women politicians at the local level, at what is called in India the panchayat level. And what these studies show is how those reservations have translated over time into better allocations in terms of education, better allocations in terms of roads, better allocations in terms of water, all of which contribute to longer-term development. So that's the smart economics point. So having said that then, what we then do, and it's always helpful in a report of this sort to start by looking at the facts. We say, so what is the status of gender equality across the world? And in doing that, we don't look only at developing countries. We look also at rich countries. We look at many of the countries that some of you are from, part of the G20. And we ask the question, how have these gaps between men and women, between boys and girls, how have they evolved particularly over the last quarter century? And what we find is a paradox. So what are the aspects of gender equality we're interested in? One of the things I would argue this report contributes to is what we do is we break down gender equality into aspects, we break it down into its constituent parts. Because one of the problems with talking about gender equality is that it's a big concept. So we ask the question, what actually matters? Well, we come to the conclusion there are three big buckets that we care about, which matter for the welfare of men and women, boys and girls. One, access to health and education, what we call in the report endowments. Second, access to economic opportunities, where men and women work, how much they earn, how productive they are. And third, very importantly, and we heard this in some of the statements from the delegates today, differences in voice or the ability to influence outcomes between men and women, outcomes at the level of society and outcomes within the household. Now, within each of these, as we look across the world, as we look at the gaps between men and women, we find this paradox. We find it in rich countries, we find it in developing countries. And the paradox is this. In some respects, these gaps have closed and closed dramatically. Education is the most striking example. If we had done this report 30 years ago, a headline would have been the gaps in education between boys and girls. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today that is not a headline of this report. The headline of this report on education is these gaps have closed dramatically. Let me give you one statistic. Out of the 90 developing countries for which we have data, these are developing countries for which we have data, more young women are in colleges, are in tertiary education than boys, in 60 out of 90 of these countries. Similarly, in 2/3 of the countries for which we have data, there are more young girls in secondary school than in primary school. Now, this isn't to say that all gaps in education have closed. If you're poor, if you live in a remote area, if you belong to an ethnic minority, yes, there are gaps. But as a rule, the gaps have closed very dramatically, and they've closed fairly quickly. What took the US 40 years to do in terms of closing the gender gap between boys and girls at primary school took Morocco less than 10 years to achieve. So that's the good news on one hand. On health, life expectancy has increased for women across the world by 20 to 25 years in different parts of the world. That's the good news. However, one of the new things we do in this report is we look at something called missing girls and women. In other words, what we do is we compare how likely women and girls are to die in developing countries compared to their counterparts in rich countries. And what we find is a staggering number. 4 million girls and women are either never born, as is the case in India and China, or they die too early, particularly in two parts of the life cycle. In infancy and early childhood, particularly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and in their reproductive ages, also in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as a result of poor maternal care and HIV/AIDS in Africa. So that's the bad news. Similarly, the same paradox applies in the case of access to economic opportunities. On the one hand, in the last 40 years, 500 million, that's with a B, women have joined the labor force. The bad news, everywhere we look, whether it's in developing countries or in rich countries, there is a gap between what men earn and what women earn. It doesn't matter if they're farmers, it doesn't matter if they're entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter if they're wage workers. And that gap persists. Third, coming to voice and agency. The good news, almost every country in the world has ratified CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In country after country, including my own in India, there are laws that protect women's rights. The bad news, the best estimates say that 500 million women are likely to be abused by their partners or their spouses over the course of their lifetime. So what we do in the report then is we spend a substantial amount of time looking at why these paradoxes exist. Because our point is, in order to design policies, which after all is what we're really concerned about, what should governments do? We need to understand why. Why do you see these paradoxes? Why do you have the kind of progress you've seen on education not mirrored in access to economic opportunities? And the headline there is, we think the way to understand progress and the lack of progress is by looking at how gender outcomes are determined, and they're determined by a combination of factors. We often hear about how norms, social norms, are what determine gender outcomes. What we argue is, yes, social norms are important, but they're not the only thing that matters. Economic incentives matters. Markets send signals about how much men and women can earn in the labor force. That makes a difference to education decisions. That makes a difference to how many children a woman will have. What matters are laws. If inheritance laws are stacked against women, that affects the ability of women to accumulate assets. And in turn, that affects their ability to be productive. We show, for instance, that there is no evidence to show that women are systematically worse farmers than men. What it can be attributed to is women have less access to land, women have less access to fertilizer, women have less access to credit. And a lot of that comes from unequal laws. So there are what we call in the report formal institutions, legal institutions in particular, service delivery institutions matter. So what we show in the report is, in order to understand what's going on in terms of gender outcomes, you need to understand how all of these interact. How do decisions within the household about whether to send your girl to school or your boy to school, whether to take your girl to hospital, whether to take your boy to hospital, how those interact with laws, service delivery institutions, what we call formal institutions, with markets, and with norms. But norms are only one of the determinants of this. So having put together that understanding, what we then do is we articulate what we think are the four key gaps or gender disparities that public policy should focus on. And the key point here is we argue that the gaps that should be focused on are the gaps that persist despite growth in incomes. So we ask the question, with higher incomes, which are the gaps that are not going to go away? Education sort of goes away. Fertility reductions do happen with higher income. But the gaps that don't go away are, first, what we call differences in excess female mortality, the missing girls and women that I mentioned. Staying with human capital for a moment, the gaps in education that are particularly applicable in areas where girls are poor or live in remote areas or belong to ethnic minorities, the gaps that are in education that are deeply entrenched. So that's one set of priorities. A second set of priorities are gaps in economic opportunities, which, as we saw, don't go away. They show up whether you look at Germany, whether you look at Ghana. Third, gaps in or differences in voice between men and women, both within society in terms of things such as political representation, representation in societal institutions more broadly, or within the household, as exemplified by things such as domestic violence, such as restrictions in mobility, such as early marriage, and the like. And fourth, and very important, what we articulate, and which is, I think, particularly relevant for this group here, is we highlight a cross-cutting area of priority, which we call the reproduction of gender inequality over time. How do inequalities stay on in generation after generation? And what we say is a particular issue there is to focus on young girls and adolescent girls and adolescent boys for three reasons. One, because this is where very important decisions regarding human and social capital are made, which are often irreversible. If a girl drops out at the age of 12, she's never going to get that education that is going to open up economic opportunities. Second, it's the age at which school-to-work transitions are made. And if those transitions aren't made right, it affects the earning power of that individual throughout her life, and therefore these leads to the inequality persisting for her children. And finally, this is also the age at which aspirations and role models are set. And so very importantly, it determines attitudes looking ahead. So what we then do in the rest of the report is in each of these areas, we articulate actions that governments can take, and in some cases, as in the case of maternal mortality, what it requires is an intervention in a single area. So the single thing that governments can do to reduce maternal mortality is improve service delivery. It's not easy to do, but it's been done. Malaysia, Sri Lanka did it at very early points in their development. The governments of countries such as India, South Africa, and others should not be allowed to say that this is a very difficult thing to do. It can be done, and it is critical. It is about women's lives. Second, but in some areas, such as gaps in economic access to economic opportunities or the persistence of gender inequality over time, it will require multiple interventions. And so, for instance, we illustrate how in terms of targeting adolescent girls, a program in Uganda shows how if you use multiple instruments, you provide access to contraception, you provide skills training, you provide role models, you can get huge impacts on adolescent girls in terms of not just their pregnancy outcomes, not just HIV/AIDS outcomes, but also their ability to stay in school and their ability to access more productive economic opportunities. And finally, we end the report by noting, and this too is relevant to this group, that it's not all about national governments. The global community has a role to play too. It can complement what national governments do, and an important part of that is the sort of partnership that this event here today represents. And in addition, what it also highlights is what many of you, as Farah said, she hopes you do go back to your countries and do, which is do innovative experiments to understand what really works in different contexts. Because one of the points this report says is despite having written 350 pages about this topic, there's a lot we still don't know about what works in particular contexts. And so let me end with that, and thank you again for the opportunity.